Well, with me to discuss this are Simon Nixon, European editor of the Wall Street Journal's Heard on the Street column, Olaf Storbeck, international economics correspondent at the German business newspaper Handelsblatt, and Professor Noreena Hertz, economist and author of IOU, The Debt Threat. Let's speak to you, Simon Nixon, first about these employment figures from the United States. 117,000 jobs created in July. The unemployment rate going down by 0.1% to 9.1. It's better than perhaps might have been expected, but is it enough?
Well, I think that the important thing is that the markets, there was a lot of wild talk going around yesterday about capitulation and repeats of 2007, 2008. And I think that was a bit premature, that what really has been driving the markets the last few days has been primarily about worries about growth. And so the good thing about these numbers, it suggests that, that we're not in a sort of yet in a double dip recession, and that and hence why the markets have reacted quite well to this already. And I think that will give people some comfort.
We needed some good news, really, on the US markets, didn't we? Because there has been a raft of poor data coming out over the past few days.
Well, what's clear is that the global economy is slowing, that the US economy is slowing, and the Eurozone economy is slowing. It's not yet clear that we're going into a double-dip recession. The problem is that as these economies slow, the debt metrics for the governments start to become tougher. And the governments themselves are no longer in a position to support recovery through big fiscal stimulus packages. So people are becoming much more anxious about how the economies are going to grow as debts are starting to be repaid. And so, that's definitely what's been the main thing that's been driving the markets. And I think, as you say, it's not fantastic news, but it's at least in the right direction.
Yeah.
Yeah, so.
Olaf Storbeck, I mean, the recession word has been used over the past few days again. Does this suggest that we're not there yet?
Well, I think the latest numbers show that the US economy isn't really falling off the cliff right now.
It's bumping along the bottom.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And I think those numbers and the recent developments show that the crisis in a broader sense isn't over yet. So the economy might not be in a recession in a technical sense, but well, it really takes some time until the debt burden, which was built up before the bubble burst, will be really worn out and carried away. So,
Noreena Hertz, how much of this current crisis that we're seeing is about confidence?
I think we have a lot of reason to be unconfident and pessimistic and worried right now. There is a potentially toxic cocktail, what with the Eurozone crisis now spreading to Spain and Italy. And we have to remember that Spain is, many times the size of Greece, Ireland, Portugal combined, and spreading to those kind of countries, coupled with US figures which, are definitely not great by any means, a flatlining US economy, plus the fact that the spending cuts that have just been agreed in the debt deal by the US will only take effect in coming months. I don't think we're out of the woods by any means yet.
We heard from the ECB yesterday that they were buying up bonds, Olaf Storbeck, but only the Portuguese and the Irish, not the Italian and Spanish bonds. And actually, that might have worried the markets even more. Some economists have claimed they're living in cloud cuckoo land. Yeah. Is that fair?
Well, I think it is. I mean, there's a lot of resistance within the Bundesbank, and Jürgen Stark, the chief economist of the ECB, supposedly has voted against those bond purchases. But I think they are absolutely necessary, and the ECB should definitely do more to calm the situation at the moment. I suppose it raises the question, Simon Nixon, whether you think this is more the responsibility of central banks or whether it's governments.
Well, I think that's the crucial issue, and I think part of what makes the current situation so toxic, and I think that, as I say, I think the main thing driving the markets is the growth worries, but the euro situation is overlaying that. And the issue there is that when the Eurozone governments decided 2 or 3 weeks ago that they would definitely impose losses on Greek government bondholders, they essentially spooked the entire Eurozone sovereign bond market. And so now any country where there's the slightest doubt about its debt sustainability, the bonds are now being sold off, and that's what we're seeing in Spain and in Italy. And I think the real issue for the ECB, and I have to say, I thought that it was quite a big gamble for them to go into the markets yesterday because, as you say, it's not at all clear yet that there is the political will to save the Eurozone. It's still quite possible that it may fall apart. And so the ECB is taking an enormous amount on trust that the Eurozone politicians will save the Eurozone, and therefore that by buying these bonds, it's not going to subject taxpayers in Germany and Benelux to big losses in the future. And
even within the ECB, that decision to intervene yesterday wasn't unanimous,
Well,
was
it's
it?
interesting that the German and Benelux council members were the ones who voted against, because they're, of course, the countries that are most likely to have to take big losses if this gamble fails. So I think it was a gamble, and I think that, as I say, Mr. Trichet, in his comments, kept saying, well, we're taking on trust what the politicians are saying and they have to go implement their proposals. But there are huge risks around that. The governments have said they're going to do these things, but they can't deliver it themselves. They have to persuade parliaments to agree these things. There's a lot of risks to come.
I think that's a really valid point. Do we have the leadership? Do we have the capability? And do we have the capacity?
Yeah, it's the political will and the tools.
Yes, to deliver. And, I don't think we know at this point. Our leaders are all on holiday. Europe's tanking, and I mean, it's a real question mark hanging over Europe. Is there the political will or even the ability for leaders to deliver? And countries do default. I mean, we all know that 86 countries have defaulted since 1975. So it's not a kind of hyperthetical.
Well, Lord Oakeshott, talking on Sky News this morning, was saying that Greece actually should have been allowed to default and should have come out of the euro.
Well, I mean, Argentina did choose to default back at the time of the Argentinian crisis, and that was the right strategic choice for Argentina at the time.
I think it would be economic suicide for Greece if they would use the euro.
No, I don't know. They would have been able to...
Economic suicide for Greece, economic suicide for Germany, economic suicide for the whole Eurozone.
I don't think they would have been able to export themselves out of the crisis. They would have decoupled from the rest of the euro. I think it's hard to know. And I think what we see now is a very integrated Europe, where the UK is, whether it likes it or not, going to be part of the problem in the...
Sure. Do we have to move further towards fiscal union?
Well, yes, I think so. I would like to take issue with one thing you said. I think I'm pretty convinced that the political will to save the euro is there in Germany and in the broader Eurozone. And I mean, Merkel said it several times, and I think she'll live up to this
Does the German taxpayer want to be footing the bill for other European countries?
Well, I mean, I think they have to, and the politicians
they might have to, but they might not. They won't.
Well,
like it,
they won't like it for sure. I mean, and you can't blame them for that. But I think there is no alternative, and politicians have to explain this to the voters, to the people. But I think all other options would be even worse, especially for German taxpayers as well. So if Greece would leave the euro, I mean, they would have a banking crisis, we would have contagion, and borrowing costs would go up higher for the other countries. So I think probably they should introduce euro bonds. I mean, there are calculations that it would cost like 15 billion euro more for Germany, which, I mean, compared to the benefits of getting the situation settled, is a pretty meager sum. So
and governments need to focus on growth. I mean, that's what the market's worried about, that countries are not growing. And, we've got unemployment perhaps slightly better in the US, but still high. 1 in 5 people in Spain unemployed. I mean, where are people going to have money to spend to get the economy going?
And that comes down to that fundamental political question about when do you make the cuts and how deep do they go?
Yes, and we risk a Japanese-type situation now.
I think a Japanese situation would almost be a good outcome in the current situation.
Japanese at kind of 97, 98, where we go into a lost half decade. Yeah.
But
it's just getting worse.
But I wish I could share your confidence. I'd have more confidence in Mrs. Merkel and the Eurozone leaders if A, there was any evidence that they were actually explaining the costs to the people of Europe about and why it was necessary to bail them out. And secondly, when they had the opportunity 3 weeks ago to introduce Eurozone bonds and to massively increase the size of the bailout funds, 2 moves that would have ended the crisis, they stopped short of that. And now, as a result of imposing losses on Greek government bonds, they've destabilised the entire European debt market. And now the costs of any future bailout are so big that the political issues become much harder. So I'd like to be as confident as you. I'm not.
I think there's a general agreement in the political establishment in Germany that the euro in itself is a political project, and that the entire European project would be at stake if the euro would fall apart.
Will the politicians be able to convince the electorate?
Well, and I think the really serious issue, and this is where I have some sympathy with Mrs. Merkel and the German politicians, is that if you do move to a Eurozone bond, how on earth do you get Mr. Berlusconi to actually do the steps that need to be done in order to make their economy competitive so that we don't have the same thing in 5 years, 10 years, the same with Spain. You know, all these European countries have lived off cheap borrowed money for a very long time. They've not reformed their economies. And I think, and I can understand that alongside Eurobonds, which I think have to be the answer, you have to have some kind of governance system that will enable the Eurozone to ensure that these countries will behave themselves, and I don't see that yet.
And that's been the big issue with Greece as well, hasn't it? Looking back to the US now, we haven't heard from Ben Bernanke yet. What's his next move got to be, Simon?
Well, I think we can... He's not called Helicopter Ben for no reason. I think we can be fairly sure what his response will be if the economy continues to get worse. Whether that's the right thing or not, I'm not sure. We've seen QE now in Japan, we've seen it in the UK, we've seen it in the US, and so far there's not really much. It's certainly not done what it was supposed to do. But what it has done is it's pushed up commodity prices around the world, which is creating inflationary problems and big problems for growth and cost of living in the developed world. So, I expect we'll see more QE because that's the only tool they've got left in their toolkit. But I don't think that'll be a magic bullet. The best it'll do is to buy more time for governments to try and sort out their economies.
And just briefly to you, Noreena, 2008, are we heading that way? Does it feel that way?
I think the speed, the synchronicity and the size of the problem really does have echoes of August 2007, September 2008, and I think we should be worried.
Storbeck?
Well, I think the situation is a little bit different because at the moment, we don't have this severe banking crisis, which is the source of the problem. So I think the situation is different, but yeah, I mean, for sure it's a new peak of the crisis.
Simon?
I think it's premature to say we're there yet, but I mean, it's clearly possible to see a path whereby we get there. But I think that right now, I still think that there are things that governments can do and policymakers can do to prevent that kind of cataclysm again.
Simon Nixon, Olaf Storbeck and Noreena Hertz, thank you to you all.